Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung is who coined that phrase persona. And persona is a mask, and all of us have many masks that we wear to engage socially and at our job, with our relationships. So personas are natural and they're fine. The issue with personas is if we over rely on them. So for some people, because personas they mask our true nature, or what we'll talk about a little bit. They're an idealized version of ourselves, and oftentimes, where we actually are, it can almost be like opposites. So when it comes to personas, a person, it isn't the ego, but a person with a strong ego is able to have a flexible persona, so they can adjust based on situation and demand, because they're not overly identified. What happens when we're overly identified with our persona is that when others don't acknowledge it or reject it, it becomes very devastating, because we have become very divorced from our true nature. So some examples could be related to like jobs and the kind of social world. So, for example, I'm a trained therapist. I remember when I taught graduate school, for some people, I could see where they were going to struggle a little bit, because their whole persona, their whole sense of self was going to come from their job, being a social worker, being a therapist. And you could see that when people would challenge them. So, like in class, if someone would challenge their perspective, you would see this pain come up. So, people oftentimes who are highly defensive, part of where that's coming from, this isn't the only place, but this is one way to understand it, is an over identification with a persona. We see that a lot, like I think politically. We're definitely seeing that, where people have um, made their identity their political party in particular, or their political perspective. And so when anyone challenges it, one, there's a rigidity of not being able to see the other perspective, because in so doing that, they would actually have to reject their persona, which is they're too overly relied in. So having a strong, healthy ego is really important. Someone that over relies on a persona does not have a strong, healthy ego. And ego is what helps balance our mind. So obviously there's different perspectives. So I'm also in recovery, and so there's a lot of talk like the ego isn't the amigo. When I'm talking about ego in this context, it's a little bit different. Ego is what balances the two kind of driving forces in our mind. And so someone without a healthy ego tends to, for example, if my ego is weak, then I might become overly impulsive or overly rule bound, but not have this kind of balance in between, where I can follow rules when it's necessary, but I also have flexibility when it's not, or um, I can act out on my needs without shaming myself and trying to rigidly fall into place. So what happens is, for many people, the more that they become overly identified with their persona or their mask, the more that they become unconscious of their true self. And so, again, becomes off balance. And so, what can happen is, if I'm working with someone and they come in and I can see this over identification with a persona, like all they can talk about is being a parent, and that's it, or being their job title, or their education, or their sexual orientation, or their race. All those things are important, but they are not your full identity. But sometimes when we don't have a healthy ego, that becomes everything. And so those are some things that I might look out for. And so what can happen is, the person becomes very obsessed with what society expects. So when they are rejected, it becomes very difficult for them, because they're now at risk of being found out, or having to face their true nature, which they've often rejected because it wasn't, they weren't encouraged or supported in, again, finding that balance. So, um, what can happen with treatment or therapy is, if you can move past, if you can identify your personas and then identify, am I over relying? If you are, then what you can start to work on is reconnecting with your true self, finding what your identity is outside of that aspect of the persona, so that you can actually start to find wholeness, because we need both. We need all pieces of ourselves in order to be whole. For as long as we're rejecting a part, we won't experience wholeness. So the image of like the yin and the yang, where the dark and the light are balanced, and then within each one, the opposite occurs. This is what happens when we start to relax our over reliance on our persona and start to heal. Is we start to experience a more balanced sense of self, a more balanced um, inner experience, which can be really helpful. So I hope that's helpful, and I encourage you to really contemplate, what are the personas that you have, the masks that you wear, that you need to wear, but also maybe have been over relying on. Thank you.